seems to be all the rave. It's Mega Ran signing off here with Super Dave. Hey, on the love.
Welcome to Super Dave Reigns and the Big Show on location at Kapow Comics and Coffee for Artist Showcase. And we are here with a very special guest, the legendary Bob Hall. Mr. Hall, welcome to Super Dave Reigns and the Big Show.
Glad for having me. I'm surprised to find I'm a legend.
Yes, sir, you are.
Does that mean I'm still alive?
Yes, sir.
Be a legend, okay.
Living legend, folks.
Okay.
So yeah, we got a minute to talk off camera. So I'm adding you to my trio of legends that I've interviewed: Ron Fournier, Colin Cantwell, and now Mr. Bob Hall. So
I'm pleased to be in that company. So thank you.
You belong there, sir. You belong there. So I've got a few questions I want to ask you. So writer, artist, and comic book creator. Wow, you've had an amazing career. Tell us about your early days at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln and at the University of Iowa.
I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska, and I spent my undergraduate years there. I was a theater major.
Right.
And was eventually oriented, I did a lot of acting, scenery design, but I was oriented toward being a theater director. And that's what I went on to study at the University of Iowa, where I was for a year, and I left. Never finished it because I thought I was going to be drafted. It was during the middle of the Vietnamese War, and I was A1 and 1A.
1A, right.
And I thought I had terrible feet, and I thought I was scared to death because I thought I would never make it through basic. What am I doing? This is awful. But they went through the physical, and they said, no, we'll take you. And went back to Nebraska, and too late to go back to the University of Iowa. Somebody sent me to the football team's orthopedic man, who sent a snotty letter to the draft board saying you could draft Mr. Hall, but he would have to have 3 different pairs of orthopedic shoes, and blah, blah, blah. And I was afraid to give it to the guy at the draft board.
Right.
And the guy said, okay, put your foot up on the table. Okay, now leave it there and put the other one up. No, you're out. And I was like, oh my God. And of course I realized eventually these guys all knew each other and stuff. But by that time, it was too late to go back to Iowa. Finished a master's degree at the University of Nebraska, went to New York, and realized I needed, although I was getting theater work, I desperately needed to find a marketable skill.
Right.
And because what happens is you go, unless you are rich.
Yes.
The best advice I ever got about being in the arts, including in comic books, was a guy named Andre Gregory, who was in a movie called My Dinner with Andre. Sometime watch it. But he was a successful theater director, the first one I met in New York. And I said, what do I do to be a theater director in New York? And he said, well, I don't know how you do it unless you're independently wealthy. I married an heiress. I don't know what you're going to do. And it turned out to be the best advice I ever got.
Right.
Because what happened would be you'd go to New York, you'd get a job, a day job, because you had to.
Right.
And then you'd never do anything because you'd become afraid to leave the day job. And eventually it just became exhausting. So a friend of mine said, well, why don't you consider drawing comic books? You've had all this you've had art training, and you can tell a story. And I had always been kind of an artist. I put myself through school doing posters and stuff like that. And I was a pretty good scene designer. And I said, yeah, okay, I remember comics. They weren't all that hard, surely. And I took a look at what was going on. This is in the early 70s.
Right.
And it was Jack Kirby was doing the New Gods. Neil Adams was doing everything, Batman, Green Lantern, the Avengers. John Buscema was drawing everything going. His brother was working as well, Sal. Barry Smith was doing Conan at the time. And Joe Kubert was doing Tarzan, and it was just one of those Renaissance times in comics. And I said, my God, I can't compete with these guys. I'm not good enough to do this, but I want to become good enough to do this.
Right.
So I started putting stuff together, and then eventually I started getting some work from Charlton. And John Buscema, the great John Buscema, advertised in the back of Marvel Comics that he was starting the John Buscema School of Comic Book Art, which meant that he was renting a conference room at the old Americana Hotel. And I auditioned for the course, got in, got to study with John for 9 months, 2 nights a week, every week. It was amazing. And at the end of the class, John got me a job with Marvel. And that's how I got into comics.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, thank God they got you.
John.
Yeah, absolutely. John, you did a great job. You got a great guy. So, wow, that's amazing. Let me ask you, so...
There's nothing else to ask. I just told you my life story.
Yeah. Well, I've been digging deep, so I've got some really good questions.
Okay.
So, we just talked about your time in New York City.
Yeah.
And you also co-authored The Passion of Dracula, which ran 2 years off Broadway, played in London's West End, and was published by Samuel French, and played on Showtime. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I juggled the comic book career and the theater career, and in the late 70s, just after I had started working in comics, I had the chance to, I was directing for a place called the George Street Playhouse in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And they wanted a production of Dracula. And I kept looking for a script to do. And there was the original Dracula, the one that Bela Lugosi was,
Right.
that the old Bela Lugosi movie is based on, but it's actually a play that Bela Lugosi played in New York clear back in the day, in the late 1920s. And it was pretty much of a clinker because it assumed that nobody knew what a vampire was and spent a lot of the time figuring that out. So I didn't want to do that one. Ended up doing one by a guy named Ted Tiller, and it was really campy, and we kind of rewrote a lot of it. And a bat was supposed to fly across the theater.
Right.
At the end of one scene, and we were in what they call a thrust theater, meaning it was surrounded by chairs, and also the theater was just starting and it had no money. And so I kept trying various ways of getting the bat to fly across the auditorium, and we tried one of those plastic birds that you wind up and it goes like this.
Right.
And it kept going around the wire, and eventually it fell off and was at my feet flopping. We of course, had painted it black, but that didn't work. And there was this guy, David Richmond, who was in the play. He was playing Jameson the butler, and Richmond is the greatest character I've ever known in my life. He just passed away a couple of years ago. We were best friends ever since then. But I didn't know him then, and my stage manager said, you've got to hire this guy to play the butler. And I said, why? And she said, because he's sleeping on my couch, and if you give him a job, I can kick him out.
Right.
Literally. And so I did. And he kept coming up to me and said, I know how to do a bat. And I would say, yeah, sure, yeah, it's fine, yeah, right, just go learn your lines. And eventually, while this thing was flopping at my feet, he came up and said, Bob, I know how to do a bat. And I said, okay. And it turns out he had toured with a guy named Dr. Silkini, the ghost master. And these were, there was a guy named Jack Baker. He was a magician. And he toured forever in the 1950s and 60s four-walling, meaning renting a movie theater in your hometown, and he would come in, show the original Dracula and Frankenstein prints, and then he would do what they called a spook show, which was a kind of a magic show where they turned out the lights and things would float around, and you would feel things running under your feet. And
Right.
the whole idea was that they turned out the lights and you got to make out with your girlfriend in the dark, as supposedly she would be screaming and you would be comforting. That was the idea. And it worked. And Jack made a lot of money doing this, and he would hire people as his assistants. And David had been one of his assistants. And Jack used what they called a spook pole, which was this long, extendable pole. And he would float these handkerchiefs around right over your head and stuff like that.
Right.
And so David said, okay, I got to admit, I've never done a bat, but let me tell you about spook poles.
Right.
And I said, yeah, I know how to do a bat with that. I'll make a screen wire bat that's kind of origami, and it will flatten. We'll paint it with luminous paint,
Right.
and we'll have Dracula will back up to the window and raise his cape, and we'll have a bunch of strobes go off, and then we'll turn out the lights and just a quick blackout, one big flash pot, and there'll be the bat, and we'll have stuck it behind him,
Right.
and when he ducks down, there will be this floating bat. And it worked so well that Clive Barnes from the New York Times, we got him to come out and see it, and he wrote a review of this
Right.
and how good the bat was. Well, we couldn't get the rights to do this version. And so the producer, a guy named Eric Krebs, underwrote us to write a new version of Dracula. And it turned out that David really could write, and he
Right.
really could write dialogue. He was a wordsmith, and I could structure things. And eventually David taught me how to write pretty words too. And we wrote this version of Dracula. Now, in the meantime, the old Bela Lugosi version, we had really checked to see, does anybody have the rights to this thing?
Right.
And yes, somebody had it under option, but they had been for years announcing that it would be running in the 1971 season or something. And it would be announced with Ricardo Montalban playing Dracula. And 2 years later, they would announce it again, but no mention of Ricardo Montalban, but Haley Mills was going to be playing the heroine.
Right.
And when that happens, it's a clear sign that they can't raise the money, and they keep trying, and it's a pretty good sign that it'll never happen.
Right.
So we felt confident. It turns out that there was a production of the Bela Lugosi version with Frank Langella waiting for their option to expire to pick up the option on that play and come into New York. And they announced they were going to do it in New York, and our first thought was we're dead in the water. We abandoned the project, which had been, the first draft was written, and we said, no, come on, we just got to be there first. And so we finished it. We rented this theater off Broadway called the Cherry Lane Theater, and we opened a month before they did to really amazing reviews. It was really good, and the bat worked even better in New York. And it ran for a couple of years, and which is a nice long run in off Broadway in New York, and got picked up by Samuel French. They're the people that publish play scripts,
Right.
and then done in London, which they just bought the rights to the script and didn't consult us on how to do it, and it stunk.
I
But
should have talked to you.
a bunch of good actors in it, but also it was very strange. They cast a guy named George Chakiris to play Dracula, who was he had won an Academy Award for West Side Story. He was the dancer in West Side Story, and unfortunately, George was kind of a has-been actor.
Right.
He never really